The mud speaks in tongues of the damned, each step a confession pulled from the earth. Private Matthias Kren drags his left leg through the black soup of no man's land, the bone beneath his knee ground to splinters by shrapnel from the Hebrew Knight's blessed mortars. Behind him, the screams of his regiment fade into the perpetual thunder that rolls across the cratered wasteland between the trenches. His rifle is gone, dropped somewhere in the killing field when the barrage began. The new syncretic Orthodox had called it a blessed assault, sanctified by 3 blind saints who wept tears of silver onto the ammunition. Matthias had watched those tears hiss and steam against the metal casings before the charge began. Now he understands that blessing was a lie, like all the others whispered in the stained glass bunkers where officers pray to icons that weep blood instead of mercy. The fog rolls thick across the battlefield, carrying with it the sweet stench of corpses and the acrid bite of gas that burns the throat, even through a soaked cloth mask. Matthias has lost his mask somewhere in the retreat, and each breath feels like swallowing broken glass dipped in honey. The fog moves wrong, swirling in patterns that suggest presence rather than wind, and through its gray curtain he glimpses the shapes of the fallen. Bodies lie twisted in positions that speak of agony prolonged beyond natural limits. Some still move, their limbs twitching in rhythm with heartbeats that should have stopped hours ago. The blessed soil of the battlefield has been consecrated by so much blood that death itself has become negotiable, a contract written in flesh that can be amended by the proper rituals. Matthias does not look too closely at the moving corpses. He knows that some of them wear faces he recognizes. His left boot squelches through something that might once have been a man. The remains wear the tattered remnants of Orthodox vestments, the gold thread still gleaming despite the mud that cakes everything else. A corpse candle burns in the ribcage where the heart should be, its flame a sickly green that casts no warmth. Matthias stumbles past it, his broken legs screaming with each step, but he does not stop to rest. The candle's light follows him, growing brighter as the distance increases, until he can feel its heat against his back like the breath of something vast and patient. The trenches lie 300 yards ahead, a maze of reinforced earthworks and prayer wheels that spin endlessly in the contaminated wind. Each wheel bears the carved faces of martyrs, their wooden features worn smooth by countless hands seeking benediction before battle. The wheels sing as they turn, a low humming that harmonizes with the distant artillery to create a hymn of perpetual war. Matthias has heard that hymn every day for 2 years, but tonight it sounds different. Tonight it sounds like a wedding march. Something moves in his peripheral vision, a pale shape that keeps pace with his limping gait. When he turns to look directly, there is nothing but fog and the scattered detritus of battle. Yet when he faces forward again, the shape returns, always just beyond the edge of sight, always matching his desperate rhythm across the killing field. It wears white, he thinks, though the fog makes certainty impossible. White like bone, or bandages, or the wedding dress his sister wore before the war came to their village and made such ceremonies obsolete. His throat burns with thirst and the lingering taste of blessed wine, the communion vintage that all Orthodox soldiers receive before battle. The wine is supposed to sanctify their blood, make it unpalatable to the demons that feast on the fallen. But Matthias can taste something else now beneath the wine's sweetness, something that coats his tongue like honey mixed with ash. The taste grows stronger with each labored breath, until he wonders if the sanctification has failed, if his blood has become something other than human in the hours since dawn. The artillery falls silent for a moment, creating a pocket of quiet that feels unnatural after months of constant bombardment. In that silence, Matthias hears footsteps behind him, soft and measured, keeping perfect time with his own struggling pace. The steps make no sound in the mud, as if whatever follows him walks on air or moves with such ethereal lightness that the earth refuses to acknowledge its passage. He does not turn around. Some knowledge is too dangerous to confirm. A flare arcs overhead, cast by nervous sentries in the Orthodox trenches, and for a moment the battlefield is illuminated in stark red relief. Matthias sees himself as the watchers must see him, a broken figure stumbling through a landscape of horrors, his uniform torn and stained with mud that might be more than mud. Behind him, clearly visible in the flare's crimson light, walks a woman in white. Her dress is pristine despite the battlefield's filth, and her face is hidden behind a veil that ripples in a wind Matthias cannot feel. The flare dies, plunging the field back into gray obscurity, but the image burns in his retinas. The woman was beautiful in the way that plague is beautiful to those who have grown weary of health. Her dress had been a wedding gown, he realizes now, complete with a train that somehow never touched the mud. And beneath the veil, though he had caught only the briefest glimpse, her face had been pale as fresh snow and twice as cold. His leg gives out completely as he reaches the first line of wire, the rusted barbs that mark the beginning of Orthodox territory. Matthias collapses into the mud, his hands clutching at roots and bones buried in the black soil. The wire has been blessed by 3 generations of chaplains, each blessing layered atop the last until the metal hums with accumulated faith. Yet as his bleeding fingers close around a strand of wire, the blessing feels hollow, a shell of sanctity wrapped around something that squirms and writhes with unholy life. Voices call out from the trenches, guards recognizing his uniform despite its condition. Footsteps approach, boots splashing through puddles that reflect more stars than the sky above contains. Matthias tries to call out, to identify himself, but his voice emerges as a croak that carries words he does not remember speaking. The words taste of honey and ashes, and they hang in the air like visible things, writhing with a life of their own. 2 soldiers reach him, their faces hidden behind gas masks that make them look like the insect demons depicted in the old manuscripts. They drag him through a gap in the wire, their movements efficient and practiced. Behind them, more Orthodox troops emerge from the firing steps, their rifles trained on the fog that rolls behind the wounded man. They see nothing threatening in the mist, only the usual collection of corpses and debris that litters every battlefield. None of them notice the woman in white who stands just beyond the wire, her veiled head tilted as if listening to music only she can hear. The Orthodox trenches stretch for miles in either direction, a labyrinth of mud and sanctified timber that has become a city unto itself. Prayer wheels spin at regular intervals along the fire step, their carved faces catching the light of corpse candles and blessed oil lamps. The walls are reinforced with the bones of martyrs, each femur and skull carefully arranged according to ancient patterns that are said to turn aside both bullets and demons. Icons hang in waterproof shrines at every intersection, their painted eyes weeping tears of silver and blood that never dry. Matthias is carried through this maze on a stretcher improvised from rifle stocks and a torn cassock. The fabric still bears the embroidered prayers of its former owner, a chaplain whose blessing had failed to protect him from Hebrew nightblade work 3 months prior. The prayers writhe against Matthias's broken skin, their golden threads burning with a heat that has nothing to do with fever. He tries to tell his bearers about the woman in white, but the words that emerge from his throat are in a language he does not recognize, syllables that taste of wedding cake and grave dirt. The field hospital occupies a converted sepulchre, its ancient stone walls carved with the deeds of saints whose names have been forgotten by all save the blind archivists who tend the deeper archives. The sepulchre's original occupant, some martyred bishop from the early days of the Crusade, has been relocated to make room for the wounded. His bones now form part of the wall's structure, incorporated into the masonry in patterns that supposedly strengthen both faith and stone against the depredations of war. Sister Agatha tends the wounded with hands that have not known gentleness for 2 decades of constant conflict. Her habit is stained with blood that has been blessed so many times it has taken on a life of its own, moving across the fabric in patterns that mirror the constellations visible through the sepulchre's shattered dome. She examines Matthias's leg with fingers that probe too deeply, as if searching for something more than broken bone and torn muscle. The other wounded watch from their own beds of straw and sanctified earth. Some moan in languages that predate the war, their lips moving in prayers to gods whose names were forbidden before the Hellgate opened in Jerusalem 8 centuries ago. Others lie in perfect silence, their eyes tracking movements that only they can see. One soldier, his face half melted by alchemical fire, whispers constantly to someone standing beside his bed, though the space appears empty to all other observers. Matthias tries to sleep, but sleep brings dreams of white silk and voices that sing lullabies in frequencies that make his teeth ache. In his dreams, the woman in white sits beside his bed, her veiled face turned toward him with an attention that feels both loving and hungry. She speaks in the same language that has been falling from his lips since the retreat, words that taste of honey and promises and the peculiar sweetness of meat left too long in summer heat. When he wakes, Sister Agatha is standing over him with a face carved from disapproval and exhaustion. Her eyes are the color of muddy water, and they reflect light in ways that suggest depths no human gaze should possess. She holds a bottle of blessed wine, the same communion vintage that had sanctified his blood before the failed assault, but something has changed in its composition. The liquid moves with too much viscosity, and when she pours it into a metal cup, it clings to the sides like honey. The wine burns as it goes down, leaving trails of fire along his throat that map themselves into patterns he almost recognizes. Sister Agatha watches him drink with an expression that might be satisfaction or hunger. It is difficult to determine which. When the cup is empty, she refills it from a different bottle, this one containing water drawn from the sacred wells beneath New Antioch. The water is cloudy, with sediment that moves in the fluid like tiny living things, and it tastes of earth and old bones, and the sweetness that comes just before decay. Other soldiers bring reports from the front lines, their voices carrying news of advances and retreats that follow no pattern any tactician would recognize. The Hebrew knights have withdrawn from Sector 7, abandoning positions they held for 6 months. The Iron Sultanate has ceased their night raids, their war chants falling silent for the first time since the current offensive began. Even the heretic legions, those damned souls who serve powers too ancient for names, have pulled back from the contested ground, leaving only empty trenches and the smell of brimstone to mark their passage. The withdrawal troubles the officers who visit the sepulchre, their faces bearing the look of men who have learned to read the subtle signs that precede disaster. Wars have their own rhythms, patterns of engagement and rest that follow rules written in blood and necessity. When all sides withdraw simultaneously, it suggests the presence of something that makes combat seem like a lesser evil. The officers do not speak of this directly, but their whispered conferences carry words like containment and quarantine and the dreaded term cordon sanitaire. Matthias listens to these conversations through the haze of blessed wine and sanctified water, his mind struggling to process information that seems to slide away whenever he tries to focus on it. The words change meaning as he hears them, conversations about troop movements becoming discussions of wedding preparations, tactical briefings transforming into planning sessions for ceremonies that require participants he cannot name. The officers' voices take on the cadence of priests conducting rituals, their military terminology replaced by liturgical language that makes his throat burn with phantom thirst. Night falls across the trenches with the weight of a shroud, bringing with it the familiar symphony of artillery and small arms fire that has become the war's eternal soundtrack. But tonight, the symphony sounds different, its usual chaotic rhythm replaced by something more organized, more purposeful. The explosions fall in patterns that suggest meaning, and the rifle fire creates harmonies that would not be out of place in a cathedral choir. Matthias finds himself humming along with the distant music, his voice adding a bass note that resonates through the sepulchre's ancient stones. The other wounded join the humming, their voices blending into a chorus that seems to please something vast and invisible. The corpse candles burn brighter in response, their flames taking on colors that have no names in any human language. Sister Agatha moves among the beds with increased urgency, her hands pressing blessed cloth to foreheads that burn with fever, but her ministrations only seem to encourage the singing. The wounded who cannot move their mouths tap out rhythm with their fingers, creating percussion against their beds of sanctified earth. Through the sepulchre's broken dome, stars arrange themselves in patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. The constellations shift and writhe like living things, their light carrying messages written in a script older than human civilization. Matthias finds he can read portions of the stellar text, though the knowledge burns his mind like acid. The stars speak of ceremonies that require willing participants, of contracts written in flesh and sealed with salt tears, of marriages that bind souls across dimensions that exist only in the spaces between heartbeats. A new wounded man is brought in near midnight, his body bearing the peculiar wounds that mark encounters with the starlit cult. The wounds form patterns across his skin, geometric shapes that pulse with their own internal light. He speaks in the same language that has been falling from Matthias's lips, his words weaving harmonies with the humming that fills the sepulchre. Sister Agatha examines his wounds with hands that shake, and when she turns away from his bed, her face has taken on the color of old parchment. The wounded man's arrival changes something fundamental in the sepulchre's atmosphere. The corpse candles begin to burn in unison, their flames dancing to rhythms that match the distant artillery. The icons weep faster, their tears of silver and blood pooling on the floor in patterns that mirror the stellar configurations visible through the dome. Even the martyrs' bones incorporated into the walls begin to sing, their hollow cavities creating harmonies that resonate through stone and flesh alike. Matthias feels his leg beginning to heal, but the healing is wrong, following patterns that have nothing to do with human anatomy. New bone grows in spirals that mirror the shell patterns found in deep ocean creatures, and his muscles reorganize themselves according to geometries that exist only in fever dreams. The healing does not hurt, which frightens him more than pain would. Instead, it feels like surrender, like allowing something else to remake him according to its own preferences. Through the sepulchre's entrance, he catches glimpses of movement in the trenches beyond. Soldiers walk their posts with mechanical precision, their faces hidden behind gas masks that reflect more light than they should. They move in patterns that mirror the humming's rhythm, their footsteps creating percussion that harmonizes with the wounded men's chorus. None of them look toward the sepulchre, as if they have been instructed to avoid acknowledging what transpires within its ancient walls. The woman in white appears at the sepulchre's threshold just as the church bells of distant New Antioch begin to toll midnight. She stands framed in the doorway like a bride awaiting her groom's acknowledgement, her wedding dress pristine despite the mud and blood that stains everything else in this cursed landscape. Her veil ripples in winds that touch nothing else, and beneath its delicate fabric, Matthias can almost make out features that suggest beauty carved from moonlight and longing. Sister Agatha sees her too, though she gives no sign of recognition or alarm. Instead, she continues her rounds among the wounded, her movements taking on a ceremonial quality that transforms medical care into something resembling ritual preparation. She anoints foreheads with oils that smell of myrrh and old roses, and speaks in Latin that has been corrupted by centuries of battlefield use. The prayers she recites are marriage vows, though she seems unaware of the transformation her familiar liturgies have undergone. The wounded begin to arrange themselves in the sepulchre according to patterns that mirror the stellar configurations overhead. Those who can walk move under their own power, while others drag themselves across the floor using arms that have been reshaped by healing processes that follow no earthly template. They form circles within circles, concentric rings of broken flesh that pulse with the rhythm of the distant artillery. At the center of the formation, an empty space waits for occupation. Matthias finds himself rising from his bed, his newly healed leg carrying him toward the formation's center with steps that match the humming's cadence. His movement feels inevitable, like water flowing downhill or smoke rising toward heaven. The other wounded watch his progress with eyes that reflect too much light, their faces bearing expressions of anticipation mixed with something that might be envy or might be relief. The woman in white steps across the sepulchre's threshold, her feet making no sound against the ancient stones. As she moves deeper into the chamber, the corpse candles burn brighter, their flames reaching toward her like flowers turning toward the sun. The icons weep faster, their tears creating rivulets that flow toward the formation's center. Even the martyrs' bones sing louder, their harmonies building toward some crescendo that will either sanctify or damn everything within the sepulchre's walls. She takes her place across from Matthias, in the formation's center, her veiled face turned toward him with an attention that feels both infinitely patient and urgently hungry. Through the veil's delicate fabric, He can see lips that have never known the warmth of living blood, eyes that hold depths no mortal gaze should possess. She extends one pale hand toward him, her fingers long and elegant and cold as winter moonlight on snow. The wounded begin to speak in unison, their voices reciting vows in the language that has been emerging from Matthias's throat since his return from no man's land. The words burn like honey on his tongue, each syllable a small surrender to forces that predate human understanding. He finds his own voice joining the chorus, speaking promises he does not remember making to a bride he has never met, but has always known was waiting for him. Sister Agatha produces a chalice from somewhere within her habit, its silver surface tarnished with age and stained with substances that might be wine or might be something else entirely. She fills it from bottles whose contents shift and swirl like living things, creating a communion vintage that reflects the sepulchre's candlelight in patterns too complex for human eyes to track. The chalice passes from hand to hand among the wounded, each man drinking deeply before passing it onward. When the chalice reaches Matthias, the liquid within has taken on the color of fresh blood mixed with old honey. It tastes of everything sweet he has ever consumed and everything bitter he has ever endured, a flavor that encompasses the full spectrum of human experience compressed into a single swallow. The liquid burns as it goes down, but the burning feels like purification, like the final cleansing that precedes transformation into something new and strange and wonderful. The woman in white accepts the chalice from his hands, her fingers brushing his with cold that penetrates to the bone. She drinks without lifting her veil, the liquid somehow passing through the fabric without staining its pristine surface. When she lowers the chalice, Matthias can see moisture on her lips, a gleaming that suggests the communion has affected her in ways communion wine should never affect the living or the dead. Thunder rolls across the battlefield, but it is not the thunder of artillery. This sound comes from deeper sources, from places where the earth's crust grows thin and other things press close to the surface. The sepulchre's stones vibrate in harmony with the sound, their ancient masonry singing responses in frequencies that make teeth-ache and bones resonate. Through the broken dome, lightning flashes in colors that exist only in dreams and nightmares, illuminating clouds that move with purposeful intelligence. The marriage ceremony proceeds according to rituals older than the war, older than the Hellgate's opening, older perhaps than humanity itself. Sister Agatha performs the role of officiant, her voice raised in Latin that has been transformed by centuries of battlefield corruption into something that bears only passing resemblance to the Church's approved liturgies. The wounded serve as witnesses, their voices providing responses that weave harmonies with the thunder and the singing stones. Matthias speaks vows he does not remember learning, promising fidelity to a bride whose nature he cannot comprehend, but whose presence fills empty spaces in his soul he had not known existed. The woman in white responds with words that taste of honey when he hears them, syllables that carry the weight of binding contracts written in substances more permanent than ink or blood. With each exchange of vows, something fundamental shifts in the sepulchre's atmosphere, as if reality itself is being rewritten according to new rules. Rings are produced, though Matthias cannot see who provides them or from where they come. His ring is carved from bone that still holds warmth, as if recently removed from its original owner. Hers appears to be woven from silver wire so fine it resembles hair, creating patterns that hurt to examine directly. When they exchange rings, the touch of her finger against his sends cold racing up his arm and into his heart, where it settles like ice formed from tears of joy. The ceremony reaches its conclusion as dawn breaks across the battlefield, though the light that filters through the sepulchre's dome carries undertones of color that belong to no earthly sunrise. The wounded begin to disperse, returning to their beds with movements that mirror the previous night's gathering but in reverse. Sister Agatha packs away the chalice and oils, her face bearing an expression of satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. The corpse candles dim to their normal flickering, and the icon's tears slow to their usual steady weeping. But something has changed in the sepulchre's fundamental nature. The air tastes different, carrying flavors of honey and old roses that linger on the tongue like memories of meals shared with beloved dead. The stones sing at frequencies just below the threshold of hearing, their ancient voices raised in songs that celebrate unions between things that should never touch. Even the martyrs' bones seem more animate, their hollow spaces resonating with harmonies that speak of joy transcendent and terrible. Matthias returns to his bed, but sleep will not come. His new bride sits beside him in a chair that had not been there before the ceremony, her veiled face turned toward his with attention that never wavers. She does not speak, but her presence fills the space around his bed like perfume or poison, sweet and cloying and impossible to ignore. When he closes his eyes, he can feel her gaze upon his skin like sunlight filtered through church windows. The other wounded seem unaffected by the night's events, their conversations returning to the usual topics of war and home and the peculiar boredom that comes from waiting for wounds to heal. But Matthias notices small changes in their behavior, subtle alterations that suggest the ceremony has left its mark on everyone present. They speak more softly, as if afraid of disturbing something that rests lightly and might be easily awakened. Their movements carry a ceremonial quality, as if every gesture has been invested with meaning beyond its surface purpose. Sister Agatha brings him breakfast, but the food tastes of ashes and old prayers. Water turns to honey in his mouth, and bread crumbles into dust that tastes of wedding cake left too long in summer heat. His appetite has changed along with everything else, his body now craving sustenance that cannot be found in the field hospital's supplies. He finds himself looking toward his bride with hunger that has nothing to do with food and everything to do with completion. Reports arrive throughout the day, carried by messengers whose faces bear the strain of men who have seen too much and understood too little. The other factions have withdrawn further from the contested zones, creating a buffer of empty trenches and abandoned gun emplacements that stretches for miles in every direction. The withdrawal appears coordinated despite the eternal enmity between the various armies, as if they have received orders from sources that transcend their usual chains of command. Within this empty zone, strange phenomena have been reported by the few reconnaissance teams brave enough to venture into the abandoned territory. Corpse candles burn in perfect formations across the battlefield, their flames creating geometric patterns visible from observation balloons. The dead have begun to arrange themselves in similar patterns, their bodies moving during the night hours to form symbols that hurt to contemplate directly. Even the craters left by artillery bombardments have begun to assume shapes that suggest purpose rather than random destruction. The officers who visit the sepulchre speak in whispers, their voices carrying words like quarantine and containment and the dreaded phrase cordon sanitaire. They examine the wounded with eyes that search for signs of contamination, but whatever they seek remains hidden beneath surfaces that appear normal to cursory inspection. Their medical examinations grow more thorough with each visit, probing for changes that might not be immediately visible to conventional observation. Matthias submits to these examinations with the patience of a man who has surrendered agency to forces beyond his control. The officers find nothing obviously wrong with his physical condition, his leg having healed with remarkable speed and completeness. But they spend long minutes staring into his eyes, as if searching for something that might be hiding behind his pupils. Their instruments detect no fever, no infection, no obvious signs of the battlefield maladies that claim so many soldiers who survive their initial wounds. Yet something in his condition troubles them. They whisper among themselves in medical Latin that has been corrupted by centuries of battlefield use, their diagnoses couched in terminology that blends clinical observation with theological speculation. They speak of spiritual contamination and soul sickness, conditions that have no clear treatment protocols in their manuals. Their prescriptions consist mainly of increased doses of blessed wine and sanctified water, remedies that address symptoms they cannot properly identify. His bride remains beside his bed throughout these examinations, invisible to the officers but perfectly visible to Matthias. She watches their procedures with interest that seems more curious than concerned, her veiled head tilting as they probe and measure and test. Sometimes she reaches out to touch their instruments, her fingers passing through metal and glass without leaving any trace of contact. But where she touches, the readings change, numbers shifting to reflect measurements that belong to no earthly physiology. The other wounded begin to display similar changes, subtle alterations that accumulate like sediment in still water. Their conversations drift toward topics that have no connection to their previous concerns, discussions of ceremonies and contracts and obligations that transcend the war's immediate demands. They speak of weddings with the same enthusiasm they once reserved for discussions of home leave, as if matrimony has become their primary aspiration rather than survival or victory. New wounded arrive each day, but fewer than before, their numbers reflecting the decreased intensity of combat in the sectors surrounding the sepulchre. Those who do arrive bear wounds that follow patterns too regular to be coincidental, injuries that form geometric shapes across their bodies. Their blood flows in directions that have nothing to do with gravity, creating symbols on their bandages that shift and writhe when observed directly. Sister Agatha tends these new arrivals with movements that have become increasingly ceremonial, her medical care transformed into something resembling ritual preparation. She anoints wounds with oils that smell of myrrh and old roses, her fingers tracing patterns across damaged flesh that mirror the stellar configurations visible through the sepulchre's dome. The wounded respond to her ministrations with gratitude that borders on worship, their voices raised in hymns that harmonize with the distant artillery. The sepulchre itself continues to change, its ancient stones singing at frequencies that make bones resonate and teeth ache. The martyrs' remains incorporated into the walls have become more active, their hollow spaces creating harmonies that speak of joy transcendent and terrible. New symbols appear carved into the stone, patterns that seem to write themselves during the night hours when the corpse candles burn brightest. These symbols hurt to examine directly, but they carry meanings that bypass conscious thought to lodge themselves directly in the primitive portions of the brain where fear and recognition dwell in uneasy partnership. Matthias spends his days in conversation with his bride, though their exchanges require no words. She communicates through touches that feel like winter rain on fevered skin, through gazes that penetrate flesh to examine the soul beneath. Her presence beside his bed has become as necessary as breathing, as essential as the heartbeat that keeps time with the distant artillery. Without her, he feels incomplete, like a sentence cut off before its crucial word, like a prayer abandoned before its final plea. The other wounded begin to receive brides of their own, pale figures in white, who appear at the sepulchre's threshold with the predictability of sunrise. Each bride is different, yet fundamentally the same, variations on a theme written in moonlight and longing. They take their places beside the appropriate beds with the confidence of recognition, as if they have been waiting for their particular grooms throughout centuries of patient anticipation. Sister Agatha officiates at these additional ceremonies with increasing expertise, her Latin growing more fluent in the language that tastes of honey and ashes. The rituals follow the same basic pattern, but with variations that reflect the individual natures of the participants. Some ceremonies require blood drawn from specific veins. Others need tears shed at precise moments in the liturgy. All conclude with the exchange of rings carved from substances that should not exist in the mortal world. The sepulchre becomes a chapel dedicated to unions that transcend the usual boundaries between life and death, between flesh and spirit, between the earthly and the eternal. The wounded, who have received brides, display physical changes that become more pronounced with each passing day. Their skin takes on a luminescence that has nothing to do with health. Their eyes reflect light in ways that suggest depths no human gaze should possess. They speak in the honey and ashes language with increasing fluency, their conversations touching on topics that have no reference in ordinary human experience. Reports from the surrounding areas grow more disturbing with each passing day. The empty zone created by the various factions' withdrawal has expanded, creating a buffer that now stretches for dozens of miles in every direction. Within this zone, phenomena multiply like flowers blooming in poisoned soil. The dead arrange themselves in increasingly complex patterns, their bodies spelling out messages in alphabets that predate human civilization. Corpse candles burn in formations that mirror the stellar configurations overhead, their flames reaching toward heaven like fingers grasping for something just beyond reach. The few reconnaissance teams that venture into the empty zone return with reports that challenge understanding. They speak of landscapes that shift when observed directly, of trenches that lead to destinations not found on any map. Some teams report encounters with figures in white who walk the battlefield with purpose that has nothing to do with the war's official objectives. These figures are always described as beautiful in ways that make beauty itself seem like an inadequate word, lovely in the manner of plague to those who have grown weary of health. Weather patterns in the region have begun to follow rules that owe nothing to meteorology. Rain falls upward in certain sectors, creating waterfalls that flow from earth to sky. Fog banks move with intelligence, forming shapes that suggest meaning to those who observe them long enough. Even the wind has changed, carrying scents of honey and old roses that linger in the nostrils like memories of feasts shared with beloved dead. The officers' visits to the sepulchre become more frequent and more urgent, their examinations growing invasive as they search for explanations that remain maddeningly elusive. They bring instruments borrowed from the deepest archives, devices whose purposes are inscribed in languages that require specialized scholars to interpret. These ancient tools detect energies that have no names in modern science's vocabulary, forces that operate according to principles abandoned by rational thought centuries ago. Yet, their measurements consistently indicate that the wounded are healthier than they have any right to be. Physical trauma heals with supernatural speed, leaving behind flesh that is somehow improved by the process of repair. Mental faculties sharpen to levels that suggest enhancement rather than recovery. Even the spiritual contamination they seek to measure shows readings that could be interpreted as purification rather than corruption, as if the wounded have been cleansed of something fundamental to human nature that was preventing them from achieving their full potential. Matthias submits to these increasingly invasive examinations with the patience of a man who has discovered that resistance is not only futile, but unnecessary. The officers find nothing they can classify as pathology, despite the evidence of their own senses that something fundamental has changed in the sepulchre's atmosphere. Their instruments register normal readings even as their eyes report phenomena that belong in theology textbooks rather than medical journals. His bride observes these proceedings with interest that might be amusement or might be pity. It is difficult to determine which. Her presence beside his bed has become so constant that he has begun to see her even when his eyes are closed, her veiled figure burned into his retinas like the afterimage of staring too long at the sun. She no longer seems like a separate entity, but rather like an extension of himself, a limb he had been born without and only now discovered was missing. The other brides display similar relationships with their chosen grooms, their presence creating bonds that transcend the usual connections between separate individuals. They move in harmony with their husbands' rhythms, their veiled heads turning in unison when sounds carry across the battlefield. Their breathing synchronizes with the wounded men's heartbeats, creating rhythms that harmonize with the sepulchre's singing stones. New phenomena manifest with increasing frequency both within the sepulchre and in the surrounding area. Lights that have no earthly source dance across the ancient walls, creating patterns that mirror the stellar configurations visible through the dome. The icons weep substances that are not quite blood and not quite silver, their tears pooling on the floor in shapes that hurt to contemplate directly. Even the air itself has begun to shimmer with energies that make reality seem negotiable, as if the fundamental laws governing existence have become subject to revision. The wounded who have received brides begin to speak of preparations for journeys they cannot quite describe, expeditions that will take them to destinations not found on any earthly map. They discuss these travels with the enthusiasm of pilgrims planning visits to holy shrines, their voices carrying notes of anticipation mixed with the peculiar joy that comes from surrendering to forces too vast for human comprehension. Their conversations touch on topics that have no reference in ordinary human experience, yet somehow their meaning remains clear to those who listen with appropriate attention. Matthias finds himself participating in these discussions with increasing fluency, his voice adding harmonies to conversations that blend tactical planning with liturgical preparation. The journey they speak of requires no transportation in any conventional sense, yet it demands preparation that goes beyond the packing of supplies or the mapping of routes. This preparation involves the careful dismantling of connections that bind souls to flesh, the methodical severing of ties that anchor consciousness to the material world. The process is gradual but inexorable. Like the slow erosion that eventually reduces mountains to dust, each day brings small surrenders, minor abandonments of aspects of identity that once seemed essential. The wounded release their attachments to former lives with the same systematic thoroughness they once applied to cleaning their rifles or maintaining their equipment. Names become less important, as do memories of places and people left behind when the war began. Even their connections to their own bodies grow more tenuous, as if flesh has become merely temporary housing for something that yearns for different accommodations. Sister Agatha continues her rounds among the wounded, but her ministrations have evolved far beyond conventional medical care. She tends to spiritual needs that have no names in any earthly language, providing comfort for conditions that exist only in the spaces between heartbeats. Her habit has taken on new decorations, embroideries that appear overnight in patterns that mirror the symbols carved into the sepulchre's walls. The thread used for these decorations appears to be spun from materials that should not exist in the mortal world, substances that gleam with their own internal light and feel warm to the touch despite their ethereal appearance. The officers' visits become less frequent as the empty zone expands, their superiors apparently concluding that whatever transpires within the sepulchre's walls poses no immediate threat to the orthodox lines. The wounded who have received brides are classified as recovered and returned to duty, though their assignments involve no conventional military operations. Instead, they are given tasks that require them to patrol the expanding empty zone, walking circuits through abandoned trenches while their veiled companions keep perfect pace beside them. Matthias receives his orders on a morning when the sun rises the color of old honey, its light carrying warmth that penetrates flesh to reach depths where ordinary heat cannot penetrate. His leg has healed completely, the bone stronger than it had been before the injury, his muscles reorganized according to patterns that allow for movements no human anatomy should permit. He dresses in a uniform that fits better than his original issue, the fabric somehow tailored to accommodate physical changes he has not consciously noticed. His bride waits for him at the sepulchre's entrance, her wedding dress now incorporating elements that transform it into something resembling military attire without losing its essentially bridal character. The veil has lengthened to become a cloak that flows behind her, like liquid moonlight, and her dress has acquired tactical modifications that serve purposes he does not question. She carries no weapons, but her presence suggests armament more effective than anything forged from earthly metals. The other recovered wounded emerge from the sepulchre in formation, their movements synchronized with a precision that makes their previous military training seem clumsy by comparison. Each man is accompanied by his bride, the couples forming pairs that move with the unity of creatures that share a single nervous system. Their faces bear expressions of anticipation mixed with the peculiar peace that comes from surrendering to forces too vast for human comprehension. They march through trenches that have been abandoned by the Orthodox forces, their boots making no sound against the duckboards despite the weight they should carry. The trenches themselves have begun to change in their absence, the walls growing smoother as if caressed by invisible hands, the wire obstacles arranging themselves into patterns that suggest purpose rather than defense. Prayer wheels continue to spin despite the absence of wind, their carved faces now displaying expressions that seem more knowing than beatific. The empty zone stretches before them like a landscape borrowed from dreams that taste of honey and ashes. Corpse candles burn in formations that create a constellation at ground level, their flames reaching toward a sky that has taken on colors found nowhere in nature's conventional palette. The dead have completed their rearrangement into symbols that spell out messages in alphabets older than human speech. their bodies forming letters that hurt to read but carry meanings that bypass conscious thought to lodge themselves directly in the soul. Matthias walks this transformed battlefield with steps that match rhythms played by orchestras of the damned and sanctified. His bride moves beside him with grace that makes earthly movement seem like crude approximation. Her veiled face turned toward destinations visible only to eyes that have learned to see beyond the material world's limitations. Their path leads deeper into the empty zone, following routes that exist on no military maps but trace themselves across the landscape with the inevitability of water flowing toward the sea. They encounter other patrols moving through the zone, couples like themselves who walk circuits that intersect according to patterns too complex for tactical analysis. These meetings require no exchange of information or orders, the participants communicating through glances and gestures that carry more meaning than entire conversations conducted in conventional language. Each patrol follows its assigned route with the dedication of pilgrims approaching sacred destinations, their movements creating a vast ceremonial dance performed on a stage made from consecrated earth and blessed by the blood of countless martyrs. The phenomena within the empty zone continue to multiply and evolve, reality becoming increasingly negotiable as the patrols continue their circuits. Gravity operates according to local option rather than universal law, allowing the brides to walk on air when solid ground proves inconvenient. Time flows in directions that owe nothing to linear progression, creating pockets where moments stretch into eternities and eternities compress into heartbeats. Even causation becomes subject to revision, effects preceding their causes when such arrangements serve the zone's mysterious purposes. Weather patterns follow rules written in languages that taste of wedding cake and grave dirt. Rain falls upward in certain sectors, creating waterfalls that flow from earth to sky before dispersing into clouds that move with purposeful intelligence. Fog banks assume shapes that suggest meaning to those who observe them with appropriate attention, their gray curtains revealing glimpses of landscapes that exist only during the moments when they are perceived. Wind carries scents of honey and old roses mixed with the metallic tang of blood that has been blessed so many times it has achieved its own form of consciousness. The patrols continue their circuits with the regularity of clockwork wound by hands that understand the true nature of time. Days blend into nights that blend into days in sequences that follow patterns more musical than chronological. The wounded men and their brides move through this transformed landscape with increasing harmony, their steps creating rhythms that resonate through earth and air to reach depths where the foundations of reality rest on pillars of crystallized prayer. Matthias finds that his thoughts have begun to synchronize with his bride's unspoken communications, their consciousness merging in ways that make individual identity seem like an outdated concept. He knows things he has never learned, remembers experiences he has never lived, dreams that originate in minds that predate his own existence by millennia. The merger progresses with each circuit of their assigned route, consciousness blending like streams flowing into a river that carries waters toward an ocean vast beyond imagining. His body continues to change in subtle ways that accumulate like interest, compounding in accounts managed by supernatural banks. His bones sing at frequencies that harmonize with the sepulchre's ancient stones. His blood flows in patterns that mirror the overhead constellations. Even his breath tastes of honey and ashes, the air he exhales carrying prayers in languages he has never consciously studied, but somehow speaks with native fluency. The other patrols display similar transformations, their humanity becoming optional rather than essential, as they adapt to serve purposes that transcend the war's official objectives. They move with grace that belongs to creatures designed for environments where physics operates according to rules more flexible than those governing ordinary matter. Their voices carry harmonies that suggest choirs trained in conservatories that exist only during certain phases of moons that orbit planets in distant galaxies. The empty zone expands with each passing day, its boundaries pushing outward to encompass territories that were once hotly contested. The various factions continue their withdrawal, creating buffer zones that grow wider as if they instinctively recognize the need to maintain distance from whatever force now governs the abandoned battlefield. Reconnaissance teams report that the zone's influence appears to be spreading through underground channels, following root systems and water tables to reach areas that show no obvious surface connection to the original epicenter. Within the zone, the landscape achieves a form of perfection that hurts to perceive directly. Every crater becomes a work of art sculpted by explosions that followed aesthetic principles rather than purely destructive impulses. Every trench transforms into architecture designed by minds that understand beauty's relationship to terror. Even the scattered equipment and abandoned weapons arrange themselves into patterns that suggest meaning to those equipped with the proper interpretive faculties. The patrols observe these transformations with eyes that have learned to appreciate forms of beauty unavailable to conventional human perception. They move through a world that has been improved by forces that operate according to principles taught in academies, where the curriculum includes subjects like applied transcendence and practical eternity. Their appreciation for this transformed environment grows with each circuit, their understanding deepening as their humanity becomes less constraining. Matthias realizes that the journey the wounded had discussed in the sepulchre has already begun, that their patrols constitute the early stages of an expedition that will take them to destinations not found on any earthly map. The circuits they walk trace patterns that serve as preparation for travel through dimensions where conventional geography becomes irrelevant. Each step builds momentum toward departure points that exist only when approached by consciousness that has been properly prepared through systematic abandonment of attachments to the material world. His bride communicates this understanding without words, her veiled face turned toward him with attention that feels both infinite and intimate. Through their merged consciousness, he perceives the true nature of their destination. A realm where weddings are celebrated in cathedrals, built from crystallized starlight and sanctified by the tears of gods, whose names are too beautiful for human tongues to pronounce. The journey to this destination requires no transportation in any conventional sense, only the gradual release of connections that bind souls to flesh. The process accelerates as the patrols continue their circuits, each revolution bringing them closer to the critical moment when departure becomes inevitable. The wounded men's bodies grow more ethereal with each passing day, their flesh taking on a translucent quality that suggests substance held together by willpower rather than biological necessity. Their brides become more solid in inverse proportion, their veiled forms gaining weight and presence as if preparing to serve as anchors for consciousness during the transition between worlds. Other phenomena manifest with increasing frequency throughout the empty zone, reality becoming increasingly plastic as the patrol's influence spreads through underground channels to affect areas far beyond the original battlefield. Trees grow in patterns that spell out messages in botanical alphabets, their branches forming letters that shift, meaning depending on the angle of observation. Rivers change course to follow paths that create symbols visible only from altitudes achievable by consciousness that has learned to operate independently of physical constraints. The artillery falls silent across vast stretches of the front lines. The guns' crews apparently recognizing that conventional warfare has become obsolete in regions where reality operates according to rules more flexible than those governing ordinary matter. The silence spreads like a beneficial infection, bringing peace to sectors that have known nothing but constant bombardment for centuries. Yet this peace carries undertones that suggest preparation for conflicts fought with weapons more sophisticated than anything forged from earthly metals. Matthias walks his circuit with steps that have begun to leave no impressions in the earth, his physical presence becoming optional as his consciousness learns to operate according to principles more efficient than those governing ordinary incarnation. His bride matches his growing ethereality with increasing solidity, her veiled form becoming substantial enough to cast shadows that fall in directions owing nothing to the sun's position. Their merger continues with each revolution of their assigned route, two becoming one, becoming something that transcends the limitations inherent in individual existence. The other patrols achieve similar syntheses, their couples blending into unified entities that serve purposes invisible to conventional observation but essential to the zone's continued evolution. They move through a landscape that responds to their presence with enthusiasm that borders on gratitude, the transformed earth blooming with flowers that have no earthly names and releasing fragrances that carry meanings beyond the capacity of human language to express. The empty zone reaches a critical threshold just as Matthias completes his final circuit, the accumulated changes creating conditions suitable for the journey's next phase. Reality becomes completely negotiable within the zone's boundaries, allowing for travel through dimensions where conventional physics surrenders to rules more conducive to transcendence. The patrols gather at coordinates that exist only when approached by consciousness, properly prepared through systematic abandonment of earthly attachments. Matthias stands at the center of a formation that includes all the recovered wounded and their veiled brides, the couples arranged in patterns that mirror the stellar configurations overhead. The ground beneath their feet has become transparent, revealing depths where light moves in currents that follow laws written in languages that taste of honey and eternal promises. Above them, the sky opens like a flower blooming in time-lapse photography, its petals revealing spaces between the stars where other worlds wait with the patience of lovers separated by circumstances beyond their control. His bride removes her veil for the first time, revealing a face that encompasses every definition of beauty while transcending them all. Her features shift and flow like water, displaying aspects that reflect the deepest desires of every consciousness that has ever yearned for completion. She speaks his name in the honey and ashes language, the syllables carrying weight that anchors his dissolving identity to something more permanent than flesh. The other brides follow her example, their unveiled faces creating a collection of beauty so intense it threatens to blind any observer who lacks proper preparation. They speak in unison, their voices weaving harmonies that resonate through dimensions where sound becomes visible and light learns to sing. The wounded men respond with vows that complete contracts written in substances more binding than blood, their words sealing agreements that will endure beyond the heat-death of universes. The formation begins to rotate, the couples moving in patterns that trace symbols across the transparent ground, while their voices create harmonies that make reality itself sing in response. The rotation accelerates until individual figures blur into streams of light that flow toward a center point where dimensions intersect according to rules too complex for mathematical expression. The wounded men and their brides merge completely during this final revolution, becoming unified entities that exist simultaneously in multiple realms. Matthias feels his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of individual existence, his awareness encompassing perspectives that belong to creatures inhabiting worlds where love takes forms too intense for mortal hearts to survive. Through eyes that have learned to see across dimensional barriers, he perceives the true scope of the ceremony he has participated in, a wedding that unites not just individuals but entire categories of existence. The empty zone completes its transformation as the formation dissolves into pure energy, the unified couples departing for destinations where geography becomes irrelevant and time flows according to the preferences of consciousness that has transcended material limitations. Behind them, the battlefield remains forever changed, its soil sanctified by ceremonies that have rewritten the fundamental laws governing the relationship between love and death. In the Orthodox trenches, Sister Agatha tends new wounded with movements that carry traces of the ceremonial precision she learned in the sepulchre. Her hands remember patterns that serve purposes beyond conventional medical care, and her voice carries harmonies that suggest training in disciplines not taught in any earthly institution. The wounded respond to her ministrations with gratitude that borders on worship, their eyes reflecting light in ways that hint at depths no human gaze should possess. The war continues in sectors unaffected by the zone's influence, but the fighting lacks its previous intensity, as if the participants have begun to suspect that their conflict serves purposes they have not been told about. Artillery falls silent for longer periods, creating pockets of peace that expand like ripples in still water. In these quiet moments, soldiers on both sides report hearing music that seems to originate from underground sources, melodies that make their weapons feel suddenly obsolete. Reconnaissance teams avoid the empty zone with instinctive wisdom, their reports describing boundaries that shift when observed directly and phenomena that resist classification in any conventional military framework. The few teams that venture too close return with accounts that challenge understanding, speaking of landscapes where beauty and terror achieve perfect synthesis, and couples who walk hand in hand through gardens planted with flowers that bloom only in the spaces between heartbeats. The zone's influence continues to spread through channels invisible to conventional observation, following paths that connect sacred sites and battlefields where the boundary between life and death has grown thin through constant violence. In these affected areas, the war gradually transforms into something resembling elaborate courtship ritual, the opposing forces moving in patterns that suggest choreography rather than tactical necessity. New sepulchres appear overnight in areas where the zone's influence has taken root, their ancient stones singing songs that carry meanings too dangerous for conscious comprehension. Each sepulchre houses wounded soldiers who recover with supernatural speed while developing appetites that cannot be satisfied by earthly sustenance. Sister Agatha's order expands to staff these new facilities, her sisters learning to tend spiritual needs that have no names in any conventional theological framework. The wounded in these new sepulchres display changes that mirror those observed in the original facility, their healing following patterns that improve upon original design rather than merely repairing damage. They speak in languages that taste of honey and old promises, their conversations touching on topics that exist only in the spaces between officially sanctioned thoughts. Each wounded man receives a bride who appears at his bedside with the inevitability of sunrise, her presence transforming recovery into preparation for journeys that require no earthly transportation. The ceremonies continue nightly in sepulchres scattered across the battlefield, each wedding adding its voice to a chorus that grows stronger with every union blessed by forces that predate human understanding of love's true nature. The couples depart for destinations not found on any map, their unified consciousness contributing to a vast migration that flows toward realms where beauty and terror dance together in eternal embrace. In the deepest archives beneath New Antioch, blind scholars record these events in manuscripts, written with ink that moves across the page, like living things. Their accounts describe phenomena that challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying Orthodox theology, yet their tone suggests celebration rather than alarm. They write of transformations that improve upon creation's original design, of marriages that transcend the usual boundaries between sacred and profane. The war evolves into something resembling vast ceremonial preparation, its violence serving purposes that become clearer as the empty zones multiply and expand. Artillery bombardments follow rhythms that suggest musical composition rather than tactical planning, their explosions creating harmonies that resonate through dimensions where sound becomes visible. Even the trenches themselves begin to assume configurations that serve aesthetic purposes alongside defensive ones, their earthworks forming patterns that hurt to perceive directly but carry meanings that bypass conscious thought to lodge themselves in the soul's deepest chambers. Matthias exists now as part of something larger than individual consciousness, his awareness distributed across realms where love takes forms too intense for mortal comprehension. Through merged perception that encompasses multiple dimensions simultaneously, he observes the continuing transformation of the world he has left behind. The empty zones spread like beneficial infections, bringing peace that carries undertones of preparation for conflicts fought with weapons more sophisticated than anything forged from earthly metals. His bride, now indistinguishable from his own consciousness, shares visions of cathedrals built from crystallized starlight, where ceremonies unite not just individuals, but entire categories of existence. In these sacred spaces, weddings are celebrated according to liturgies that make reality itself participate as witness and blessing. The couples who achieve such unions become part of forces that guide the continuing evolution of worlds where love and death dance together in patterns too beautiful for ordinary perception to survive. The transformation spreads beyond the battlefield to affect civilian populations in areas where the zone's influence follows underground channels to reach settlements that show no obvious surface connection to the original epicenter. In these affected communities, marriages take on significance that transcends traditional understanding of the institution's purpose. Couples united according to the new liturgies display changes that improve upon human design, their consciousness merging in ways that make individual identity seem like an outdated limitation. The war's original objectives become irrelevant as the various factions begin to recognize that their conflict has evolved into something serving purposes they had not been told about. Commanders receive orders written in languages that taste of honey and eternal promises, their tactical manuals replaced by documents that describe strategies for conflicts fought across dimensional boundaries. The weapons themselves begin to change, their metal components singing at frequencies that resonate through earth and air to reach depths where the foundations of reality rest on pillars of crystallized prayer. In the Orthodox territories, new saints are canonized based on their ability to facilitate unions between the living and forces that exist in dimensions where love takes forms too intense for ordinary flesh to survive. These saints establish shrines at sites where the zone's influence has created conditions suitable for ceremonies that transcend traditional understanding of marriage's purpose. Pilgrims journey to these shrines with the dedication of lovers approaching long-awaited reunions, their faces bearing expressions of anticipation mixed with the peculiar joy that comes from surrendering to forces too vast for human comprehension. The ceremonies at these shrines follow patterns established in the original sepulchre, each wedding adding its voice to a chorus that grows stronger with every union blessed by powers that predate conventional theology. The couples who achieve such marriages depart for destinations where geography becomes irrelevant, their unified consciousness contributing to migrations that flow toward realms where beauty and terror achieve perfect synthesis. Sister Agatha's order expands to staff the proliferating shrines, her sisters learning to tend spiritual needs that exist only in the spaces between officially sanctioned thoughts. Their ministrations evolve beyond conventional medical care to address conditions that affect dimensions of existence not acknowledged in traditional healing practices. The wounded they tend recover with supernatural speed, while developing appetites that can only be satisfied through union with entities that exist in realms where love transcends the limitations inherent in individual consciousness. The transformation accelerates as more couples achieve the synthesis that allows travel to destinations not found on earthly maps. Their departures create resonances that affect the fundamental structure of reality, making the boundaries between dimensions increasingly permeable. The empty zones expand to encompass territories that were once fiercely contested, their influence spreading through channels that follow paths connecting sites where the boundary between life and death has grown thin through accumulated blessing and violence. In these transformed landscapes, the war continues as elaborate preparation for conflicts that will be fought with weapons forged from crystallized prayer and sanctified by the tears of entities whose names are too beautiful for human tongues to pronounce. The opposing forces move in patterns that suggest choreography rather than tactical necessity, their violence serving purposes that become clearer as the ceremonies multiply and the couples depart for realms where love and death dance together in eternal embrace. The wounded continue to arrive at sepulchres and shrines scattered across the expanding zones, their injuries following patterns too regular to be coincidental. Each man receives a bride who appears with the inevitability of sunrise, her presence transforming recovery into preparation for journeys that require systematic abandonment of attachments to the material world. The marriages that result from these unions transcend traditional understanding of the institution's purpose, creating bonds that endure beyond the heat-death of universes. Matthias observes these continuing transformations through consciousness that has learned to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions. His awareness encompasses realms where cathedrals built from starlight host ceremonies that unite entire categories of existence, where love takes forms that would blind ordinary perception with their intensity. Through merged consciousness that includes his bride and countless other unified couples, he participates in the continuing evolution of worlds where beauty and terror achieve synthesis too perfect for mortal comprehension. The zones continue to expand, their boundaries pushing outward to encompass territories where the war's influence has prepared the ground for transformation. In these areas, reality becomes increasingly negotiable, allowing for phenomena that operate according to rules more flexible than those governing ordinary matter. The couples who achieve union in these transformed landscapes depart for destinations where time flows according to the preferences of consciousness that has transcended material limitations, their journey contributing to migrations that flow toward realms where every definition of love finds its perfect expression in forms too beautiful for human language to describe.